Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am Stacy Hudgens. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and Principal Scientific Advisor at Clinical Outcome Solutions. We are really happy to jointly present this webinar on cross-functional collaboration, real-world data evidence generation, and presentation. I'm happy to present with colleagues from each of our partner organizations, which includes Carevive, Genesis Research, and Fingerpost. So I'm joined by Aaron Galesnik, Chris Pashos, and Shannon Lee. Each will have time to present on real-world data evidence and generation. I'm going to jump into just talking about what the Oncology Outcomes Strategic Advisory Partnership is. The Oncology Outcomes Partnership has been around for multiple years and supports sponsors throughout the drug development continuum, essentially leveraging the strengths and expertise of each partner to provide integrated solutions across a drug development pipeline, specifically in oncology, not only to address the needs of drug development programs in terms of clinical trials, but also thinking outside of clinical trials and expanding into the regulatory and market access landscape. Our collaboration enhances quality of oncology development programs in that each of us bring a unique service, especially in the real world area in terms of strategy and expertise. And so I think at the end of today, I'm really interested to hear more. And so if you are going to ASCO, there will be several of us at ASCO who would be happy to meet with you as well. So our data-driven and value-driven partners, our collaboration aims to enhance the quality of oncology clinical trials and accelerate the development of new cancer therapies by bringing together clinical trial, real-world data, and real-world evidence experts. And across our groups, we have the ability not only to collect what you're going to hear from Aaron specifically, but to derive, analyze, and communicate patient-centered outcomes. I put a description of each of the companies, but I am going to allow each speaker to talk about their unique contribution as well as the groups that they work with. I'll start with Clinical Outcome Solutions. We're a global outcomes research scientific organization. Our work is really in the integration of clinical outcome assessments, both qualitative and quantitative, psychometric and statistical and strategic work to really inform patient-focused clinical benefit. We do quite a bit of work in the oncology space and have for the last 10 years of our existence. We have worked in a number of indications to bring oncology drugs forward, but also to communicate patient outcomes in terms of symptoms, function, tolerability, and et cetera. So the mission of our group, and I will say the mission not of COS, but the mission of the Oncology Outcomes Strategic Advisory Partnership is to provide dedicated strategic advice for your oncology patient-centered evidence strategy. And really what we've been working on looking at across our organizations is not only some of the guidances that have come out from FDA and EMA, but also thinking about the health technology space and market access, which really dives further in with our partners, Fingerpost, who help us build together and show evidence of how individual HTAs and EMA has reviewed oncology drugs. And therein, Chris will then talk about some of the extensive services that Genesis offers to really think beyond, the post-marketing, but also the early planning for trials and such. So each group will be talking about the learning objectives today, which I have here outlined. So the importance of cross-functional collaboration. So this cross-functional collaboration is able to really generate real-world data and communicate real-world evidence seamlessly as scientific partners. We're going to show some examples of how we've gotten some of our work out into the public domain and actually how we've been working together across the organizations. Next, define and definition and importance of real-world data and real-world evidence, particularly in the current environment where we have published, particularly where, start over, sorry, clinical trials focus on a specific target patient population, and we're really going to be talking about the real-world data and real-world evidence and how we can inform patient outcomes beyond the clinical trial, particularly with the publication of guidances that have come out from the FDA, but also when we think specifically about how EMA has responded to real-world data collection. So another objective is to really think about how do you do it, and our colleague Aaron Glesnick is really going to talk about the work that with Carevive and also some of the analytic work that he has ongoing. They've really penetrated the market in terms of what they can do with the data they're collecting in oncology and the scientific rigor of that data collection. I've already talked about the objective around clinical development and post-marketing timelines. So really thinking about generation, how it aligns and can align to your clinical timelines, and how you can really use it to optimize stakeholder engagement. And then finally, available data and methodologies and opportunities for that collaboration. So the cross-functional partnership and communications, I'm just going to say a few things here. So I'm going to talk about how we even started with the scientific collaborative group. We support the planning, analysis, and communication of oncology clinical programs, but the need for a network to really expand our internal expertise came about with a previous colleague to really incorporate experts from other scientific organizations, which allow our industry sponsors a seamless way of moving from early planning, implementation, analysis of their registrational trials, but then what happens next? A drug is approved, it's in the market, it's in the real world space. How do we identify partners where we can really work collaboratively with the industry sponsor and another scientific organization? And so this partnership was born with the intention of providing that level of seamless support. And so we identified a need, and then we were very blessed to meet all of these very skilled partners. So here's an example from Lenvima, which is a treatment for differentiated thyroid cancer. Clinical Outcome Solutions led the data collection, analysis, and interpretation of real-world data to support the derivation of quality of life evidence for Lenvima, followed by review by EMA's Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use. So the EMA's review. As you can see here, the EMA specifically noted that that quality of life data was not collected within the context of the clinical trial, and you really need to understand symptomatic deterioration, if you will, in this patient population. So for these patients, they become very symptomatic and very ill, and so the sponsor organization, ASI, was challenged to go and collect quality of life data. And as you can see here in this slide, we were able to go into the real world and obtain data in this very difficult, hard to recruit patient population to really provide patient evidence from a real world study. And as you can see here, it was requested that this data be submitted so to help the EMA interpret quality of life. What's in the background here, and we do have the citations for these, is we had multiple posters and a publication on differentiated thyroid cancer in the real world setting. So this was one of the first pieces that we pulled together, and Fingerpost, I want to especially thank them for helping to pull this information together, because what Fingerpost brought to the table was how this was reviewed. And what we had was how we answered it by going and doing observational data in this very specific patient population to really guide the, the communication of real world evidence to support the interpretation of patient outcomes, but also to respond specifically to regulators who were requesting that information. Another example, and in this one again, this is in the public domain. Clinical Outcome Solutions and FingerPost, we collaborated on a targeted landscape review to identify any considerations of patient-focused outcome data, clinical effectiveness, safety, patient and social aspects, and the COA measures to capture this. As you can see here, let me do this. You can see here, you can see the payer landscape and the PROs that were included to really talk about how the HTAs were reviewing this. This is really important when you're setting up a new clinical program, because if you're coming into a market that already has existing treatments, we really want to know how the individual HTAs reviewed that quality of life data. So this is an example of our collaborative efforts together in two very specific real world examples. And so this is not really about how in lymphoma these tools were assessed or how the HTAs looked at it. This is a demonstration of how you can expand your competitive landscape to really go beyond and think about HTA review and how patient outcomes were reviewed in new drug applications. So I would be remiss if I did not bring up this wonderful paper that we collaborated on. Carevive and Clinical Outcome Solutions collaborated as co-authors on a consortium of real-world data scientists focused on the developing of a framework for ePRO data for ePRO measurement tools collected in real-world oncology. This paper is available. It was published by Friends of Cancer. And it was a great collaborative opportunity for us to have a say in how these data are collected and provide a framework for really what your expectations in the market should be for world data in oncology. And now I'm going to pass the microphone on and ask for Aaron to take control.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. Thanks for the setup. So I think at this point, we're going to turn the conversation to real-world evidence and its role in oncology outcomes, both the gathering of the data and the generation of evidence. Chris Pashos from Genesis and I will be covering this section. But start off with just a grounding again in just what is sort of the definition of real-world evidence, real data, why it matters. Have here the definitions from the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. Really, what is real data? It's data on patient health status and routine healthcare delivery. Typically, we think of it as sort of the passive electronic forms of data that are generated as byproducts of the information age, claims, EMR, wearable data, app data. But it can also apply to data gathered prospectively in things like disease registries. And real evidence, of course, is the actual clinical evidence generated from that data on use and benefits of different health interventions or health practices. And this can be, as often we think of this as something that's assessed retrospectively, but it can also be gathered prospectively as well. Now, why is real data and real evidence important? Well, here's the hint, especially in oncology, clinical trials are not always enough. The table on the right refers to sort of really what's the difference between a randomized controlled trial and real evidence. Step back, well, what is a randomized controlled trial? It's a carefully controlled experiment to tease out the incremental benefit of a particular treatment. As in any carefully controlled experiment, you want to control as many other variables as possible. You want to have pretty much a defined treatment setting. You want to have fixed assessments of how people are doing. You want to pretty much control what regimens people are on, and you want to have a pretty homogeneous population in it. Now, that doesn't really help you much if you want to understand things like how's a treatment going to be used in real life across the whole breadth of potential providers, patients, usage patterns, and the like. So that's one thing. So randomized control just won't be able to answer questions like that. Second off, trials aren't always feasible. And we're talking about oncology here. So you get conditions that are very rare or where the standard of care is not very good. So it's questionably It's possibly unethical to run a clinical trial against a comparator group. And also the standard of care in oncology changes very quickly. And so getting evidence in a timely fashion to inform provider decision-making is not always, can't always wait for the conducting of a clinical trial. Trials are a fixed point in time in a fixed number of patients. The advantage of real-world data is that it can be across a larger number of patients on an ongoing basis. Yes, it's going to be a lot more inconsistent and heterogeneous, but that also becomes its strength because it can cover a wider range of patient types, usage applications, and the like, to really sort of understand how best to use treatments, in the real world. So moving on from there, so what is the value of real-world evidence to life science? My colleague Chris is going to go into this in a lot more detail, but at a high level, there's applications across the development life cycle of pharmaceutical products, early discovery, unmet need, hypothesis generation, development stage, clinical trial planning, selecting populations, selecting comparators, designing endpoints, launch phase, understanding what's the bridge between efficacy from trials to effectiveness in the real world, utilization patterns, adherence, things like that. And life cycle management, opportunities for new indications, expansions, things like that. So again, application throughout the life cycle, particularly important in oncology, where the time from bench to bedside tends to be quite short. But also moving beyond just life sciences, there's also value to regulators, real evidence. This diagram is one from the Duke Margolis Institute, which talks about the use of real-world evidence, early in development on outward. We do see increasing use of real-world evidence to support new drug approvals, especially in accelerated approval contexts. This becomes important in oncology, where there's a lot of single-arm trials and accelerated approvals, given the severity and acuity of the need for new cancer treatments. And as such, you find real data being used for historical benchmarks, external controls, synthetic controls, and we'll hear more about that later. There's actually even more use in the post-approval setting, I think. Once drugs are on market, efficacy and safety has been established in clinical trials, then there's opportunity to use real data to deepen understanding in kind of the way phase 4 trials do. New indications, new populations, dosing refinements for labels. If you get to post-marketing safety assessments, that's used routinely by regulators. Take something like the Sentinel Initiative, where there's a whole infrastructure in place to conduct rapid safety signal assessment in the real world in the US across a network of real data providers. And that's just used regularly. Yeah. If you move over to what's the value of real data to payers, that's even clearer because regulators have to think about the efficacy and safety of products. Payers also have to think about things like cost effectiveness and appropriate utilization. This diagram here indicates some of the various ways in which that can help payers. Blue boxes here on the left indicate how real data informs utilization review. Are patients taking the medicine properly? Are they adherent and persistent to it? How's it being prescribed in the real world once it's outside of the control of a clinical trial setting? How's it being used across different patient populations of interest, for the personalized medicine opportunities? Also for larger decision-making, comparative effectiveness, cost effectiveness, resource utilization. These are all very important questions that real data can help inform. And given the acuity of cancer and the cost of oncology medications, this becomes very important. So I'm going to pause here and talk a little about what Carevive's role in the Oncology Outcomes Partnership is. We basically are a source of one particular form of health status data, patient-reported outcomes, quality of life assessments, that is typically not found in the real world, and we gathered in the real world. Typically, this is data you find in clinical trials or registries, but we have a platform for remote symptom monitoring for oncology practices, which takes validated scientific questionnaires for patient-reported outcomes and deploys them in a clinical practice setting. It's used to help providers understand how patients are experiencing their time on therapy when they're not in the office, and actually report back symptoms, function, quality of life. And this data we integrate with EMR data to create a real data asset that provides this type of health status data that's typically not found in the real world, in a real world practice setting. So I think in terms of what exactly we are gathering in our platform, this slide here on the left shows the domains that we gather. And we aligned it here to the FDA's core guidance for oncology PROs in clinical trials, but we capture the same domains. Now, obviously, we're a real-world data platform, and part of clinical practice, so we can't be as exhaustive as like data gathering in a trial, but we cover the same domains that are called out in the FDA guidance of disease symptoms, treatment symptomatic impact, and also physical function and role function. In particular, I want to call out that for our core symptom battery, we use the questions derived from the PRO CTCAE, a battery of questions developed validated by the FDA to look at frequency, severity, and interference of key symptoms that patients might be experiencing to really sort of characterize what the patient's experience on treatment is. So I'm going to turn now to a quick case example. This is some work we did together with the COS, really sort of evaluating how our platform can be used to show patient experience in clinical practice, in this case in breast cancer. Here we compared overall breast cancer with patients who have triple-negative breast cancer, a genomically significant subset that tends to have poor prognosis. And really, we wanted to understand what's sort of the symptomatic impact of disease and treatment, as well as the impact on physical and role function. So here's an example. Take one symptom that comes up a lot in treatment for breast cancer, in this case, diarrhea. Here we looked at the severity of diarrhea occurring over time in the population, in this case, over the first 4 months of treatment. We looked at the general population. We looked at those with triple-negative breast cancer. So because the PRO-CTCAE lets us tease out severity of symptoms, we can see what's the incidence of severe symptoms on a weekly basis in the population. We see in this example, it's a little higher in the general population than the triple-negative breast cancer population. There's a level of granularity about symptom acuity you don't typically get easily from real-world data, but we are able to. Now, we can take this one step further because in our surveys that we're administering with patients, we can also look at function. In this case, we use the PROMIS 4A, which looks at chores, stairs, walking, and errands. We see that even though the incidence of severe symptoms is higher in the general population with breast cancer, the functional impact is actually kind of comparable. So this is a level of nuance that we can tease out with our data, not to understand what patients are experiencing in a granular and systematic way that you don't find readily outside of trials, but also what's it doing to patients' daily living, their function, their quality of life, their level of treatment bother they're experiencing. And that's really something that we think we bring to the Oncology Outcomes Partnership, is the ability to have this kind of insight into populations in the real world on contemporary treatments and current standard of care that can be useful for both informing development planning as well as generating evidence. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Chris Pashos from Genesis, who's going to go a lot deeper into other applications of real-world evidence in the development process and some very exciting examples.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aaron. Earlier at the start of the conversation, Stacy presented why we came together. Different organizations, different overall missions, but all of us coming together to eliminate silos across our teams to be able to deliver to our life science sponsors information that they need for their development process, for their commercialization, across that life cycle. And ultimately, it's about bringing greater efficiency into the research enterprise. Overall, certainly, we're all aware that we have less time, less financial resources in order to do the good work that is needed to discover, develop, commercialize new therapeutic offerings. And we want to do our part on the consulting side to make sure that you're able, as life science companies, to be as efficient with your research spend as possible. And so bringing together the different organizations allows us to share with you different types of expertise, just as within your companies, you're also breaking down the silos between your functions, between your global, regional, local affiliates, coming together to make sure that what you need to be able to know internally for your programs, what you're able to share, as Aaron and Stacy said, with regulators, with HTAs and payers, with the medical community, ultimately with the patients, is going to be on target, available at the right time, so that your efficiency and your effectiveness of your research program is what it should be. And Genesis takes that message internally as well. We're working with our sponsors to ensure that we're working as one team, ensuring that the biostatistical expertise, the epidemiologic expertise, the analytical experience is all brought to bear at the right time with the right data and the right understanding of what those external stakeholders need to be able to deliver the right work at the right time. And we're not just great scientists, we're also taking advantage of technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing to increase the efficiency of what we're able to deliver. And I know it's something that Aaron and the Carevive team also have invested in to make sure that those insights from the data are able to be delivered as quickly and efficiently and well as possible. We are data agnostic. We're very pleased to be part of this partnership where we have the opportunity to take advantage of the Carevive offering. And there are some critical use cases that have been illustrated here where we've been pleased to partner with Carevive. At the same time, we understand that the world is beyond the United States, and we also work with data assets, data availability around the world. And we hope that together, the expertise that we're bringing as a partnership will be germane and relevant to your needs, whether you're focused on North America or whether you're focused more globally and more worldwide. So let me go ahead and build on what Aaron had presented before in terms of that development, commercialization, use of real-world evidence. And in fact, it can start before human trials. And some of what we're doing with respect to understanding the disease, understanding the patient population, acknowledging that in oncology, you have tumor types or you have particular aspects of cancer that are themselves very heterogeneous. And we want to make sure that we're understanding that full heterogeneity of the disease presentation, the diagnosis, the management over time. And we want to make sure that our life science companies understand that. And there's no better way to do that than using real world data to look at that heterogeneity of disease, of heterogeneity of treatment, heterogeneity of outcomes, and being able to understand then how does that change over time? How does that affected by the variety of available therapeutic regimens on the academic side, on the community side? We're going to take a look at that, and that helps you to understand that disease in all its glory so that you can effectively target where do you think, given your mechanism of action, given the early understanding of that therapy or that potential product, where is it going to have a positive effect? So we start early, and then as you're going through early development, late development, you're learning more. One of the important aspects that Stacy and Aaron shared is the motivation by FDA. And I can say the motivation is not just from the FDA, also the EMA, and other regulators around the world are motivating us, motivating life science companies, motivating those of us who work for the life sciences companies to be able to understand not just standard clinical outcomes as reflected in the medical chart, but also understanding from the patient perspective what matters to the patient. And that's why that partnership of understanding clinical outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, other aspects of the disease is so critical to our full understanding of the disease, so that we can then identify where is this new product having an impact, and then how do we correlate the hopefully improvement in clinical outcomes, the improvement in patient-reported outcomes, how do we see them over time? And that's all on us as researchers to understand, ensuring that we have the available data, ensuring that we bring to bear the appropriate analytical methods, both traditional biostatistical as well as some of the new ML, machine learning, natural language processing, et cetera, tools that we can use to help identify patterns and hopefully then use those as hypothesis generating to apply other statistical techniques. So you can see there that what we do with RWE varies. We want to make sure that we're using the appropriate data, the appropriate analytical methods at the right time to inform your internal decision-making, whether you're part of the HUR Market Access Medical Affairs sub-team of the development program, whether you're on the pharmacovigilance or the clinical development aspects of those program teams and product teams. RWD, RWE have something of value for you, and we want to make sure that we're delivering that combination of clinical expertise as well as patient outcomes expertise at the right time. So let's go on to the next page, and this goes back to the FDA, where when they put together their clinical outcomes assessment roadmap, you could see in 3 of the pillars, we're talking about RWE, understanding the disease and condition, as we just talked about, the natural history, the patient heterogeneity, subpopulations, how are they treated, how are they receiving care. That's all coming from data like Carevive's that help us understand exactly those types of issues. And then working through, as Stacy and her team do, trying to understand what's important to the patient, not just clinically, but also with respect to the clinical outcomes, the patient-reported outcomes, the health-related quality of life, social, functional, psychological, that are the meat and potatoes of a COA. And being able to link the understanding of the disease, the conceptualization of treatment benefit, and then finally either selecting an existing outcomes measure or developing and validating a new one, that's all connected. The FDA wants to make sure that when they're evaluating your clinical trial program, you've done this RWE, you've done this COA assessment in a comprehensive way that feeds, validates, and shows the relevance and reliability of what your total evidence package looks like. And then of course, everything that we do is governed by the need for reliability and relevance. And the big key phrase there is fit for purpose. So understanding these aspects of your RWE program, complementing your clinical trial program, is going to be critical. And the value of this partnership is that we're bringing together those different perspectives that allow you and allow the ultimate stakeholders to whom you're presenting these data to be able to show that thread, that logical progression of how you did your work, how you're planning to do your work, et cetera. And it's also important that this not be done at the last minute. So thank goodness the regulators, the HTAs and payers are much more forthcoming in terms of being accessible for early advice meetings prior to phase 2. Where you're able to present, here's what we intend to do, get that feedback, and be able to get comfort and confidence in advance that your program is going to be met, assuming the data are what you expect, are going to be met with favor. So overall, just to summarize some of the key areas where RWE is so important, it certainly, as I just said, informs the clinical trial design elements and makes it possible for FDA, EMA, the HTAs to help inform you as to whether you're on the right track or not. It also contextualizes what your clinical trial data show. And whether we're talking about safety and tolerability endpoints or effectiveness endpoints, it goes without saying, if you can show how your product is more efficacious or as safe, if not safer, you do that with that RWE, and it strengthens what you're able to present to the regulators and the HTAs. Number 3, and this goes to the whole value of our partnership here on the Oncology Outcomes Strategic Advisory Partnership. It's all about making sure that that patient input, that patient impact is part of the story. And there are very few available opportunities to bring together clinical and patient-reported outcomes. We do that and make that a core part of what we do for you. And of course, that last bullet, it's all about efficiency, reducing the time to effective regulatory approval, market authorization, and hopefully with positive submissions to the HTAs and the payers, reducing that time to the coverage, reimbursement, financing of your innovative therapies. One example that I think is so important that we're doing increasingly, especially in oncology and in rare diseases, is the use of the external control arm. And in fact, if you attended the ISPOR International meeting a couple of weeks ago, you heard 2 of my colleagues, Craig Parzinski, Jen Wogan, present at one of the HEOR theaters on just this important aspect of the use of RWE, a very innovative use of RWE that's come online the last half decade, and that is the use of external control arms. And you can see that the FDA, EMA are much more open to this. Obviously, there are certain conditions where they're open to ECAs. Certainly, if you're working in a common disease, very common disease, typically they're not going to consider ECAs, but across different cancer types, including those that Stacy and Aaron have already talked about, we've seen the use of ECAs, and we've been right in the middle of providing that assistance for our life science sponsors. One example, if I can turn this, there we go. So here, the issue is what data are available that allow us to be able to present to the EMA, in this case, and the FDA, what data were appropriate for the ECA. Are these data sufficiently relevant, sufficiently reliable, and to be able to garner successful submission to the regulator. And so we did a variety of investigations, feasibility assessments, et cetera. In this case, the big issue was PFS, progression-free survival, and we wanted to make sure that the regulators would accept that, yes, this particular data source they would be sufficiently comfortable with how it was coded, how it was entered, how we were analyzing that relative to other clinical outcomes, as well as other outcomes that were important to the regulators. And in this case, we used a particular medical record database to be able to garner that comfort on the part of the regulator. So thank goodness we presented that early with the life science company to the regulator, got their buy-in, and then the analysis as well was met with success, and it was the basis for a successful submission. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over back to my colleagues.
Great, thanks for that. So I'm going to now cover the impact of COA measures in health technology assessment. And so with regards to pricing, reimbursement, and access for new products, it's increasingly being driven by a positive HTA review. And patient-relevant endpoints and patient-reported outcomes are also playing a greater role in the HTA decision process. So it's important to understand what COA measures have been accepted or criticized during the HTA evaluations, because this helps in planning what measurements to include in the pivotal clinical trials, because the payers and the HTA agencies are increasingly looking at this type of data to determine whether or not to recommend reimbursement for a product. The other thing that it plays a role in the HTA process is also the patient input process, and this is also gaining traction as well. For instance, there's increasing number of patient advocacy groups which are engaging in the HTA submission process, where they give their feedback to the expert committees in terms of what endpoints are important to them, how the disease impacts their daily life, and how this new therapy improves their way of life and why it should be reimbursed. And so it's helpful for the different companies to engage with the patient groups early in the process to understand which endpoints to include and which COA measures to potentially include in the pivotal trials. So the influence of COA measures on reimbursement and access has been increasing. And you can see, in Europe, many of the HTA agencies, the COA measures are having a greater role in their HTA decisions. And the US is also on a similar trajectory, where this type of data is playing a greater role in differentiating between the current treatments that are reimbursed and the new treatments that are coming to market. The box on the right here shows examples of why it's important to include COA measures in the HTA submission. So for instance, in Germany, health-related quality of life is a key assessment criteria, and the review of the manufacturer's dossier will not continue if the expert committee deems that the endpoints are not patient relevant. From a NICE and SMC perspective, the COA measures play a great role in the assessment of cost effectiveness through QALYs, and this often sets the bar for what they think is cost effective and also for price negotiations for listing a drug in the specific regions. In terms of COA measures' impact on HTA review process in Canada and the US, right now it's mainly used by the expert committees in understanding the disease state, understanding what the impact is on patients, and it kind of serves as a framework for the expert committee when they're reviewing the submission dossier that's been prepared by the manufacturer. And just to give some background on the role of COA measures in health technology assessment, quite a few of the HTA agencies across the world have published guidelines describing their preferred type of COA measures and also how it should be incorporated into the HTA submission. So you can see in the third column, published guidance shows in the green dots that they provide guidance there if it's preferred or not preferred. And then the last two columns show whether the HTA agencies have any preference for generic COA measures or disease-specific ones. And in general, reading through the different guidances across the HTA agencies, the most commonly referred to generic COA measure was the EQ5D for that. In terms of what the HTA agencies are looking at when they review the COA data, they consider it more reliable and credible if it's collected in a rigorous trial design. So for instance, they reference oftentimes the randomized controlled trials as being the gold standard for capturing data. They're also interested in seeing, if possible, comparative data captured in the head-to-head trials. And oftentimes it's important that the comparator includes one that is used in the country itself. So they want to see that it's relevant to their patient population. The other thing they're looking at is with the COA measures, they want the instrument one that is internationally recognized, that there's publications supporting that it's reliable and valid in this disease state, and also that these measures are collective prospectively as well as pre-specified, as opposed to a post hoc analysis. And then in terms of what they're looking for in the results, oftentimes they're looking for both statistically significant improvements as well as clinically relevant improvements. So moving on to some our examples for patient-relevant data in the field of oncology. As I discussed earlier, there has been an increasing use of COA measures and patient-relevant data in HTA recommendations and the review process across multiple disease areas, but most notably in oncology. This is the most, I would say, advanced therapeutic area where you see developments occurring. And also, this therapeutic area has a large number of patient organizations. And as I mentioned earlier, that patient input process is important because, for instance, if you're including the patients and caregivers in the clinical trial design, this can create more relevant studies that better reflect the patient experience with therapy. And it also ensures that the outcomes are important to the patients and that they're measured in randomized controlled trials, which are the preferred data collection method for the HTA agencies at this time. In our example that we did work with the COS team, this one was a review of HTA evaluations for therapies used to treat breast cancer across the various HTA agencies. So in this review, you can see that it did have an impact on the HTA outcomes, and in particular, the EORTC, QLQ-C30, and the BR23 were discussed most frequently across the HTA agency evaluations. And they were not just discussed in passing. There was some detailed discussion, and they were interested in seeing that there were statistically significant and clinically relevant improvements, and also what the impact of the therapy was on quality of life, because that played a great role in seeing, the therapy might be more effective, but if it was adversely affecting the quality of life because of side effects, that factored into their recommendations. In terms of the measures itself, the HTA evaluations did discuss the measures and whether they were valid or not. And across all the HTA agencies, they approved of the use of the EORTC C30 and the BR23. And they also acknowledged that they were, they measured what they were supposed to measure and they could be relied upon. And now I'll pass it back to the group for some question and answers.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to open this up for questions. I just want to summarize briefly. Well, I know we have a question here that I believe is for you, Erin, but I do want to thank the speakers today for your contribution to the Oncology Outcomes Scientific Advisory Partnership. But I also want to just take a moment to talk briefly about, when you're thinking about your drug development program, you're seeing from Chris's fantastic example of how you can use data in the public domain and when synthesized by a group like Genesis Research to act as a control and provide more confidence and reliability in the outcomes, especially in those single-arm trials. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of consideration for single-arm trials in oncology, to Chris's point. So when you think about what Chris presented, and then you think about the Carevive data set, the ability to leverage and optimize rigorously collected real-world data to inform a control arm, and how do you do that with valid and reliable outcome measures that also, to Shannon's point, allow us to really say, is this fit for purpose for bringing in the patient voice, and can we be confident in how we use real world data and generate real world evidence to inform control arms, particularly in single arm studies, will also allow us to really respond not only to regulators and payers, to all three of my co-speakers' presentations. So we do have a question, and we want to thank you all for attending. And as I said, many of us will be at ASCO, but we are also going to be posting this presentation and allow for follow-up. We've included all of our contact details. So there is a question from Julie, and how does Jennifer, or not Jennifer, how does Genesis administer the site-based questionnaires mentioned, digitally or with an app? I believe this is directed at Carevive.
Sure, I can answer that. So it's the platform itself. It's a self-contained solution that can deploy surveys electronically. It can be either by a link to a website or through our native apps, Apple and Android, either one. And essentially, the platform itself allows for deploying of the questionnaires, gathering of the results back, and then pushing them back into the EMR where that's configured at our site level. I think so that's essentially how it's administered. And those are baseline and on a weekly basis for the time period patients are in active therapy. I think that kind of segues into the next question here on the Q&A I see, which is acknowledging. I think it says the speaker says in Brazil we have trouble integrating PRO's digital solutions into generate real evidence in traditional process and habits of doctors. How to overcome that? I'll say it's not easy. We have a customer success team at Carevive. Many of them are former oncology nurses. And as part of an implementation process for any health system we're employed in, the team goes in, sits down with the doctors and the nurses, maps out the workflow, how they see patients today, then creates a workflow to integrate how they would work with the platform alongside that workflow in a way that is synergistic with their work practices, and then trains the team and then stays in regular contact with them afterwards, often on a weekly basis, even after implementation, to make sure that they are able to use the platform, not having any problems, addressing needs as they come up, and troubleshooting issues. So it really involves having people who understand the workflow of the clinicians involved and adapting the process for using the platform to that workflow when they roll it out. But it's not an easy challenge, but we like to think we've been doing it for a while and have some expertise at it.
And I just want to add to that, other digital solutions as we think about, not only as we think about digital data collection in the real world space, we also think about what is the framework. And so for that data collection, and so in the paper that was put together by Friends of Cancer, in which a framework was developed, I think we can also reflect on the way in which large phase 3 data are collected as well. And so as the field moves into digital health technologies, I think the comment you're raising here around integrating PROs and other digital solutions in other markets, I think to Chris's point earlier around worldwide data collection, I think this is something that we have to tackle next. We have frameworks out. There are publications now around how to collect valid and reliable electronic patient-reported outcomes data, but putting it into practice and testing it, usability testing, and et cetera. I think there's a lot of work ongoing, and I think your question is great. How do you overcome that? I think Aaron's point, it's difficult, but I think the Carevive team's the right people to talk to about that. We have time for one more question or one more comment, so maybe I'll ask each of the speakers, put you on the spot and ask you to say, we don't have, let's see if we have one more question here coming up. Nope. I'm going to start with Chris because I see you. We're going to go from far right to left on my screen. So I'll let each of the speakers give a few seconds of a close, and I want to thank everyone. So, Chris?
Thank you, Stacy. From my perspective, it's all about bringing together the relevant perspectives of all the different stakeholders so that they all have a voice, and making sure then that the evidence planning, execution, communication is done mindful of all those different stakeholders and targeted at all those different stakeholders at the right time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Shannon?
Thanks. I would, build upon that as well, that it's important to get in the early planning when you're developing the clinical trials. And also, I think a lot of times people look at HTA and payers as the end process, but it's, part of the beginning where you want to make sure that those endpoints that are important to the payers and HTA agencies are included in your clinical trials. And also to look at the real world evidence generation plan as well, because that also happens where you don't think about it from a market access perspective until you've done all the work and you have the product with you. But that real world evidence planning should come early on before the product is even launched. So you have time to collect, what the patient experiences on the therapy and provide to the payers when you come ask them for reimbursement for your product.
Thank you. And Aaron, I believe you and I have said our piece, but I want to thank everyone. And I also am going to give another plug. While this is the introduction to the Oncology Outcomes Strategic Advisory Partnership, we will be hosting a second webinar later this summer with a case study across each of our organizations. Aaron and Shannon kind of got you started with an example in breast cancer, but we are going to have a second webinar where we take a case study forward. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.